we're going to talk about lessons learned.
Like
All right.
lessons learned in AI engineering.
Yeah.
The light on.
So my name's Mitch White. I've been an engineer and a manager for over 20 years. The last 13 of it, which have been here in the Portland metro area. In that time, I've been a developer, QA. I've been a software manager and director. And recently I've become an AI engineer at Cornell University. The thing about AI engineering is that it's not a field that existed when I graduated from college. AI existed, but that wasn't a job. It was basically a subset of things in computer science that were used to solve other kinds of problems. Now it's a big field with a lot of subdomains. One thing that you might notice if you've been paying attention to the news is that LLMs, large language models, have taken over as the predominant form of AI. So in the use of the AI nowadays, it's pretty heavy for software development and also testing. And we're going to focus a lot on the testing aspect of that today. So as a QA professional, you might find yourself using or verifying a system that involves agents, chatbots, or MCP systems. And because of the great presentation we had from Joseph earlier, we've got a pretty good understanding of what MCP systems are. Let me just quickly define. Yeah. Let me just quickly define what agents are. Those are pieces of software that use inference as part of their decision making. So they're actually using an LLM to make heuristic or fuzzy decisions. The true blue agents you might think of would be things that can control cars, computers, spaceships. They're not quite there yet, but we can get pretty far just by adding traditional deterministic code to an LLM, and we can get reasonable decisions and behaviors. Most everyone has seen chatbots, ChatGPT, and this year you should see a lot of MCP systems. So now we want to ask ourselves, well, what kind of issues are you going to see with QA, with AI? Well, there are a couple of things that come out. AI can build the wrong product. Now, why does that happen? Well, sometimes AI systems are usually trained on more common cases of computing. So an example would be, you might ask ChatGPT to build a website. For some reason, when you ask it to do that, it always wants to do it in React and Tailwind CSS. Now, I don't have anything against Tailwind, but that is an example of how an AI can be biased. Many times when they're training it, the decisions that it makes are based on what was popular at the time that it was trained. There can also be side effects. And side effects in particular can be difficult for someone who is a QA. The reason is it makes your testing more difficult. What do I mean by that? Well, it produces some code, it's really good looking, but maybe it has a few extra variables in there, maybe a few extra lines of code. To try to find those things, you can't always use functional testing because there's no effect of these things. You need to have code reviews. That's helpful. Regression testing is also important. One of the things, though, is you have to be really careful about how you focus that regression test, because these problems don't typically emerge until you get your code to a certain size. And then there's the memory problem. We've heard a few people talk about that today. It used to be that if you spoke to an AI for a few hours, it would start to forget things. The AI vendors are getting better at that. There's actually been a lot of progress in the last 2 or 3 months. What would happen is after you got to it, to a certain point, it would just forget something that happened at the beginning or the end or the middle of your chat. If you were trying to test such a system, you have to build test cases that are going to involve memory that it might need to remember from a certain point in time in that conversation. And of course, the test cases aren't going to run the same way each time you run it because of the randomness that's inherent when you're working with one of these systems. So the systems are getting better, and they're not always forgetting things because they're starting to have bigger context windows, but they still can forget emphasis. Okay. So although there are these issues, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't use AIs. In fact, they do give us a lot of speed. Um, they can give you a second opinion when you're writing a test case, or when you're trying to have it look at a test plan. The thing is, um, you just have to take what it gives you in stride. You have to say, if someone else gave me this advice, would I take that advice the same way? You know, you're doing that with the computer. The fact that it can speed up your ability to write reports is important, but you're going to have to do a little bit more work in terms of checking and editing the output of those AI. So there are going to be some longer cycles of getting things right. There are also some human issues that come up when you're working with AI systems, and that is sometimes people start to get reliant if you have a good system on that AI, thinking that it's perfect, and that of course could be another issue. One of the problems is that AI will randomly put things into your code system, and so you have to have a good priority system in terms of saying, what is it that my system has to do, like 100% of the time? Always test those areas. Always make sure that we have a good system for making sure that the system fundamentally works. So your smoke test becomes a little bit more important. Finally, or I should say next, I want to give you some best practices. First one is write, plan yourself. That's what we're here for. If you're doing quality, if you're actually developing quality plans, then ask the AI for feedback. They can produce test cases, they can produce test plans, but they're not always going to have the context, the domain knowledge that you are able to bring to the system. You can use AI to help with writing, but you need to write with your own voice. And you can tell because there are certain things that AIs tend to do. So I have a few AI isms here from ChatGPT. About 2 months ago, the EM dash is basically a dash, extra hyphen, was super popular, and a lot of school programs would look for EM dashes in students writing to see if they're using it to write their paper. Now the AI vendors have taken that out, but there are other things that it does. It'll make certain comparisons. It'll say, it's not X, it's Y. It'll say, and that's rare. And if you argue with it, it always says, you're right to call that out. These little AI isms are going to be detectable if you have enough quantity of writing. And so you're not going to want to have those things in your papers and your reports that you're creating with it, unless it's of low importance. And if you're at school, just don't do it. The other thing I would say as a best practice is get the best IDE and agent system you can. So they have chat windows, and there's sort of a hierarchy. There's the desktop chats, there's the which are kind of like better versions of the web-based chats. The only reason why they're better is because if you're using the web-based chats, what happens when the chat gets long is the browser itself starts to slow down. So you're isolated from that when you're using the desktop chat. But you can go further than that. You can use an IDE like Visual Studio Code. Google has a system called anti-gravity. And around the time that, I put this presentation together, Anthropic announced Claude Code, or Claude Cowork, which is essentially a sort of a IDE that can talk to regular documents, but it's not oriented towards developers. It's oriented towards regular office workers. Use a product like that because it can write files, it can read files, it can do a little bit more than you can do if you're just copying and pasting back and forth with a web or desktop chat. And that'll save you a lot of time, and that can be quite useful. So my hope is that, I've given you some ideas to think about, and I'm happy to talk about this, afterwards. But until then, thanks for your time.